Hello everyone, welcome. I'm Jeevan Vasag, I'm climate editor at Tortoise. Welcome to the launch of the Better Food Index, second edition of. If you'll forgive me, I'm going to start with a note of sentimentality. I'm going to talk about my dad. So my dad grew up in northern Sri Lanka in a family where there wasn't enough to eat, where there literally wasn't enough to eat. And I remember that he was astonished and delighted by the range of food, the quality of food that existed in Britain. He was also a fitness freak, so we never told him exactly what went into mashed potatoes, for example, or either given up eating them. But I'm saying this because I think a lot of the time when we talk about food in these contexts, we often feel like we're criticising food, like we're taking the joy out of it. And I want us to remember that there is joy in food, there's pleasure in food, that's what it's about. Journalists are often accused of being cynical. I don't really think that we are. I think that we are perhaps the most optimistic segment of society because we believe that very fragile things, words that we commit to digital paper, can actually change the world. So we're here to try and do a bit of that in a very small way today. I'm going to start by, I'm not going to say we're not going to spend too much time on the findings. We're going to try and get into kind of showing our working, how we got there, what this tells us, picking out some of the trends. We do want to hear from you and make this a conversation. There are mics in the room. Just wave at me if you want to come in. But I'm going to start with my colleague, Maddie Diamond, who's lead researcher at Tortoise and is really the kind of brains behind the Better Food Index. Maddie, just give us a sense of how we got here, what the workings are, and what the really kind of key findings are.
Sure. So for those that don't know, is my mic on? Can everyone hear me okay? Cool. So the Better Food Index is a comprehensive assessment of the largest companies in the UK food system, both the food and the drink companies. And I suppose the point of the index is to shine a light on where these companies are currently performing, but also where they're aiming to be in 10, 15, 20 years' time. So the way that we do that is we look at what they say they're doing, which is our talk pillar, and what they are actually doing, which is the walk. And this is divided into a series of different areas. So we've got environment, social impact, nutrition, affordability, and financial sustainability. So it really is a very comprehensive understanding of what sustainability is. And we approach it from that direction because it is complicated. It's hard to know who's doing well. And so using public data predominantly, we are trying to identify who's at the top and who's at the bottom.
So who is at the top and who's at the bottom? Give us that.
Yeah, so at the top is Cranswick. So they are a predominantly own label producer in the UK. They make meat, deli, antipasti. You've probably eaten their foods, but you didn't even know that they were the ones behind it. And they're there predominantly because they're very good at reporting. They are the most transparent company in the index. And on their reporting, they've got really good statistics on emissions and environment, which is a really key part of our assessment. So Cranswick are at the top this year. Second is Nestlé. They were top last year. And so Nestlé, again, transparent, a large multinational company. We would kind of expect that. But they do perform very well across environment, social impact metrics. And then finally, we have Britvic. They are a drinks producer. They make Robinson squash. Here we go. And they've improved quite a lot since last year, so they're up 10 places. And that is because, again, they're very transparent. So hopefully what you're hearing here is that when you report good data, you are rewarded. And that is what our index does.
And shall we just look at the bottom?
Sure thing. So at the bottom, if we go to the next slide, we have Pladis UK and Ireland. They're behind McVitie's Digestives. They are at the bottom here alongside Muller and Safina UK. Safina UK is a pork and seafood producer. They're owned by a Canadian company. And these companies are really at the bottom, not because they are awful in every part of our index. As you can see, even Pladis UK, quite good on social impact. They're at the bottom predominantly because there's a lack of reporting, and where it really matters, they are falling down. And so I suppose what these rankings actually mean, a ranking, an index could be quite reductive. Who's top, who's bottom, what does it all mean? And I suppose what we're trying to say is that it's really difficult to be a sustainable business across every single aspect of an operation. And so we recognise that, we empathise with it, but that's kind of what we're seeing this year.
If a company comes top, Maddie, what does that say about the company? Does it say primarily that they've been very transparent? I mean, what's the sort of key understanding thing we should take away?
Yeah, so I think transparency is probably the most important part of our index. So Cranswick is the most transparent company across the board. And so they are there for that, predominantly for that reason, but they do perform very well across environment and the other metrics, as we can see in the pillars.
It really is remarkable that a company that makes sausages has come top for transparency. It's not something you associate with sausage making. Okay, Will Mower, who's data scientist at Tortoise. The companies, as I understand it, have pretty low scores overall.
Yes, that's right.
What does that tell us?
So we've got to be quite careful when we look at the scores explicitly, because there's a lot going on there. And so we built the index not with a sort of an ideal food company. We've taken all the food companies and they're compared to each other, and that's where that score comes from. And so to put it into context a little bit, 100 would be a company that scores, that is completely transparent, as in they report on every indicator, every metric we think is applicable to them.
Yeah.
And they would top every single metric, so they would be the best company. So there would only be able to be one company with a score of 100. Realistically, there are sort of trade-offs that come with, as Maddie spoke about, with sort of performing sustainably in every facet.
Yeah.
So we see that it's actually really challenging to do well on all of them, and the low scores, if you've got a keen eye, you'll see they'll have changed since last year. And that's,
so you say a perfect score is virtually impossible?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. All right.
But the scores are not there to go like there's 77 more sort of points to go for the company.
Yeah.
Is to put it into perspective, and that's why we want to look specifically at the rankings.
Yeah.
We can glean some information from the scores, notably that they're reasonably compact and that the companies are sort of, there isn't that much room to play with.
When you say reasonably compact, so if you sort of plot them on a graph, they cluster together, is that what you mean? Or,
yeah, so the majority of the companies are between sort of like 20 and 30.
Okay.
And in large part that is because of transparency.
Okay.
So that plays a huge role in this.
Okay.
Yeah.
And well, this is obviously the second iteration of this index. Could you just give us a sense of what's changed between the first and second? Where have we seen progress this year in this version of the index?
So I think the main thing we've seen is an increase in Scope 3 reporting.
Okay.
So now, if I remember correctly, I think 26 companies report some form of Scope 3 emissions.
Because this is a knowledgeable room, I'm assuming everybody knows what Scope 3 emissions means.
So Scope 3
Anyone who doesn't know is too afraid to admit it, obviously. So, yeah.
But we can clarify that. I wonder. It's sort of anything that's not directly in your control.
So it's across your whole supply chain, value chain. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's really challenging to report that. And so that's where we see a disparity between the Scope 1 and 2 emissions and the Scope 3 emissions. So while some companies, they'll report, let's say, 80,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent Scope 1 and 2 emissions, they'll report 50 tonnes of Scope 3, which is really unrealistic, but it's really challenging. So whilst it's challenging, that's sort of quite a misleading number. So we've noticed that there are still quite a significant proportion of companies who do this underreporting Scope 3 emissions. But we take that into consideration with our scoring. We don't score companies worse for higher Scope 3 emissions because of the challenges around that.
Sure. Okay.
Yep. I think another area of progress is that the companies in our index have really engaged with us more this year than last year. So when we first launched the index, it really was a one-of-its-kind assessment of these specific companies. They've never been benchmarked against their peers in that way before. So in our index, you have these global multinational companies. You also have UK-based companies.
Did they find it an enjoyable experience? Don't answer that.
I won't. But they really have engaged with us. And I think that is because sustainability really matters quite materially to their business. And to be ranked against your peers in a public way, it's a really good assessment for them to benchmark themselves. But it's also really important for the whole industry to gather around, okay, where's the collective action needed here? And where can we galvanise change in the future?
Thanks, Maddie. Sophie Barnett, who's a researcher on the index. Sophie, I just want to come to you on emissions and just ask about progress on cutting emissions, because we've tracked that too. Could you just talk to us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So as Will mentioned, we've seen an increase in Scope 3 transparency, but we even where companies are reporting more Scope 3 emissions, that doesn't necessarily mean that their emissions are increasing. It might just mean that they're getting better at knowing what they're doing. So the index doesn't penalise companies directly for the value of their Scope 3 emissions. Instead, if we want to look at whether emissions are going up or down, we look to the Scope 1 and 2, so the direct emissions and emissions associated with the power that companies source. Each of our indicators requires comparing companies of different sizes. So for each indicator, we will scale by revenue. So when we do this, we get a measure of emissions intensity, so how much are companies emitting compared to their revenue. And if we compare this year on year, we can see that emissions intensity has gone up in the index by about 5% for Scopes 1 and 2.
Yeah, and obviously what we need to see as a society is the reverse of that. It's producing more food at a lower level of intensity. Yeah, okay. Mike, let me come to you. So for those of you who don't know who Mike is, well, you launched and implemented Plan A at Marks & Spencer, sustainability advisor now. Mike, give us your initial thoughts on what you've heard so far and your initial thoughts on the index.
Well, I mean, firstly, great piece of work. I mean, I spent 20 years at M&S getting the grey hair on my head dealing with things like this. And I remember the first year or two of it, it was a right old pain. You know, it's a lot of work, a bit of embarrassment in the public domain when you didn't do as well as you wanted to. But we learned to love indexes, whether it was on cotton or it was on wood or whether it was on palm oil and soy, on human rights and animal welfare. Actually embracing this and understanding where M&S was relative to the rest of the industry in terms of best practice became a really powerful driver for change. And I think it's doubly so now because in the past it was all driven by reputation. You know, you didn't want to be embarrassed on the front page of Tortoise or The Guardian for being in the wrong space with your brand. Now it's much more existential than that. We're flying into a storm. We're dealing with here the most polluting industry on the planet in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, food waste, water use, deforestation, etc. We're dealing with one that's the most vulnerable to the problems it causes, extreme weather events driving down yields, availability in a growing population. And it's the most complex to decarbonise or change. We're not talking about you had a diesel car and now it's electric, which is a relatively simple narrative. Yeah. There are so many different pathways on this. So my first point to everybody is embrace gathering that data to tell you what your business model needs to look like in a rapidly transforming food system. One detail on that to the food industry themselves. Beware what you're sailing into with the big retailers now. I can start to see them probing, being the gatekeeper on behalf of their customers, hundreds of thousands of SKUs. No one's going to look at the labels, carbon labels, health labels on hundreds of thousands of products. The big retailers will turn around and say, bottom 20% in a category, shows your data, not performing well, off my shelf. You lose access to the marketplace. That's transformation. You need to understand that even if you don't share the information, which you should with the public domain. Penultimate point, I'd also say this is really important then about informing strategic decisions in the boardroom. You're going to have to make some really big bets as a food company, a food retailer in the next 3 to 5 years. And you want the best possible data to decide whether you divest from a particular category, you sort of invest into another one, where you position yourself, how you work with your retail partners to get to the marketplace. So again, strategic literacy built upon data and transparency is critical. And that takes me to the final point, partnership. This is huge, changing the world food system. Not even some of the world's biggest food companies that we've seen named in the index can do this on their own. And I think what we need now is a strategic, collective understanding of where we need to get the food system to and our role in doing that. And my final point in all of this is clearly the policy system that we require to help us transform. I'll pick my words carefully, no, it won't. It's moribund. You know, we can't turn around at a time of crisis, of transformation and say, leave it to the marketplace, leave it to consumers' choice. We simply can't. But we need to make really good choices at policy system level. And again, that depends upon data on a systems level and at an individual company level as well. So data, transparency at the heart of your future food system.
Thanks very much, Mike. There's more to say, but I'd love to hear from the room before we go on. Hi there. Just tell us who you are as well before we start. Thank you.
Sure, very happy to. Hi, I'm Steph. I'm the CEO of Altruistic. We're a sustainability data management company. We work with a lot of food businesses on a lot of the challenges that have come up here. Question to the food index team. So scope 3 is, of course, a lot like a sausage, and there's a lot of stuff that sits beneath the hood of that. What I'd love to understand is to what extent do you look at the sort of elements beneath the scope 3 classification? And so, for example, at the simplest level, it could be, is it audited, has a third party signed off on it? But at the more complex level, for instance, you're going to have to start splitting out land use and land management and land use change from that as part of the upcoming GHG protocol guidance on flag, for instance. Would love to understand how much you unpack Scope 3.
Okay, I'd love to take some more points from the room, though, before we answer that. Any comments or questions? Yeah.
Well, to that gentleman's point, I'd like to chuck in.
Just if you could grab the mic. Brilliant, thank you.
Sorry, Simon Pelicanek. To that gentleman's point, I'd like to chuck in, the farmland is the base, if you like, of a lot of those Scope 3s. So I'm interested in soil health, whether that features remotely in assessment. Thank you.
And what's your background, Simon?
I invest in regenerative
thanks.
food
Brilliant.
companies.
Maddie, do you want to take the Scope 3 question? Yeah.
Sure. So I suppose in terms of observations that we've seen is that it really does vary. Some companies report in very much great levels of detail exactly where their Scope 3 emissions are coming from. And those reports could be audited, they might be public companies. On the other hand, some companies are only reporting their transport emissions, which is part of the company's house filing system. So, and it is quite laughable. You do see these huge companies reporting 50, 60, 70, 80 tons of emissions, which is just completely under-reporting from our perspective their whole impact across the system. So I suppose from an observation perspective, we have seen that. And we also, report or collect information on Scope 1 and 2 emissions as well as other kind of proxies and measures for environmental impacts across the index.
One quick additional point there. I mean, there's a real risk here that Tesco and Sainsbury's ask for different Scope 3 data in different ways. Nestle and Unilever ask for it in different ways. We need one common approach for efficiency reasons, for reporting and transparency reasons. And again, people like RAP are starting to drive like commonality of you should all be asking the same questions on the same data base as well. So again, I would push us all to get behind a common reporting data system.
Thanks, Mike. And there's another comment, I think, at the back of the room. Hi.
Tom Jeffrey, I'm a former campaign strategist on public health and sustainability. Question really for Mike, and it may be a bit philosophical, so bear with me here. Sustainability leads, or those with responsibility for sustainability, often have different positions within the C-suite, different relationship to core decision-making in a company. You talked about embracing the indexes, but is there a danger? How do you view the proliferation of different metrics you're reporting on, and how does it help you make the case?
And it's not a philosophical question, it's a really important one. And ultimately, you realise as a business, you need one data system that if whether an investor asks for it, Tortoise asks for it, Greenpeace asks for it, or your board asks for it to make a big decision about the future direction of your business, it's one core data system. And again, I won't say too much at this stage because but I look at a C-suite and say, do you collectively own this? And you've got a chief sustainability officer there as your servant to go off and do your tasks. But ultimately, it's you, the C-suite, deciding what you need and owning it. I would suspect there are too many businesses in this index that have got a good specialist, head of ESG, head of sustainability. You manage that for me. You collect some data. You keep these guys happy. Job's done. And my test bed here is a business with one data system that's serving all needs, but predominantly strategic decision-making about where your business is going.
Great, thanks, Mike. I'd like to dig into another topic that we've sort of really tried to surface in the index this year, and that is ultra-processed food. So when the data team first explained ultra-processed food to me, I felt a bit like the Supreme Court judge who's asked to talk about pornography and said, well, I can't define it for you, but I know it when I see it. Maddie, could you please explain what ultra-processed food is?
It is a very difficult question, and it's been in the news quite a lot lately. Chris Van Tulleken's book, Ultra Processed People, you may have seen it or read it, indeed. It's, I suppose, it's a way of defining all types of food, and we use the Nova classification in our index, which breaks down all food into 4 categories, and one of those categories is ultra processed food. And so what is ultra-processed food? Well, some people say that it's the number of ingredients in the food. Other people say it's the type of the ingredients in the food. Is it unhealthy additives or chemicals that you can't find naturally or your grandma wouldn't recognise? Another way of understanding it is the level of processing. So how many stages did that product go through in order to make its final product? And then the other way of viewing them is the purpose of processing? Is it to make food tastier, more addictive, more affordable? Is it to cut costs anywhere down the system? So it's super complicated, and the way that we've approached it this year is we've been looking at the types of additives in the food itself. So we felt that this was the way that we could approach it as a small team. So it's pragmatic, but also tells us something quite interesting about the food that is in the largest food companies.
And just share the finding on that, Maddie.
Yeah, so we found that approximately 2/3 of the food in the index is considered to be ultra-processed. And then to go a bit further, ultra-processed food is twice as likely to be considered unhealthy from the government's nutrient profile method. So ultra-processed food has, the science is growing, but it is clear it does have very adverse consequences for your health, but also for the planet as well. And so we've been looking at that this year based on some feedback from last year that we should attempt to approach it and just join the conversation around it, because it is complicated, but we feel like it was worth doing.
And what exactly is the relationship between ultra-processed food and high-fat, sugar and salt, which is the sort of more typical way that we used to thinking about the healthiness or unhealthiness of food, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, it's twice as likely to be considered all of those bad things, really. So ultra-processed...
But is there something intrinsic in the process of transforming the food that it itself is considered to have a negative health effect?
I would say so, yeah. I think, Chris Van Tulleken would say so, Kevin Hart would say so. Experts are starting to speak out on this, and they're saying that ultra-processed food is not just the process, it's all those other things that I mentioned. So what is being added to food, what the purpose is, and how many ingredients there are.
Okay, thanks, Maddie. Mike, what's your view on this? And do you have a sense that the industry is grappling with this, understands that it's an issue?
So what I see both in government circles and business circles is total silos. So I'll go, government's got DEFRA, it's got Department of Health. I'll go some of these big food companies. I'll meet a world-class nutrition and health team over here and a world-class sustainability team, but they never talk to each other. So point number one, the most important word in the future is the word well-being. It's not sustainability. It's well-being for you, the individual, well-being for the planet and for others. The businesses, and again I'm going to use a controversial word here, that own the word well-being into the future, the ones that prosper and win, not the word sustainability. So that's point number one. Point number two, the reason that we've seen a degree of traction on climate, and I stress degree, is that we have a quite clear hierarchy of IPCC says this, the science, COP says this, the global response. There's net zero definition, there's a TCFD definition in terms of reporting, scopes 1, 2 and 3, bang, 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 bang. Business is not doing enough on that hierarchy, but I basically know where I need to get to as a business in 2040, 95% less emissions than today. When we talk about ultra-processed food or even HFSS, I don't know where we're trying to get to. So you've done a great job at starting to link calories to pound of turnover. Great, thank you for telling me that. Do I need to be reducing HFSS or by ultra-processed food by 95% by 2040? What is the end point that we're trying to get to? What's that sort of word that run through the stick of rock that enables a business to respond on this? I appreciate it's not your job to do, but quite rapidly, if we're going to start to sort of take a bite out of this great challenge, dietary challenge that we face, is that we need to start to construct it. And again, I would say to my colleagues in the food industry, don't wait for somebody else to do it to you, because it won't suit you. Get on your front foot and start to define where we're trying to get to with diets.
Yeah, I think that particular point is a really interesting one. It's one that's very unclear to me, even after a few weeks of kind of working with the team on this. What is the amount of ultra-processed food that there ought to be in someone's diet? Is it none at all? Is it 5%? And I don't know, Maddie or Will, in the process of your conversations, whether you've got a sense of kind of, what part does it play in someone's diet? Should it play?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because a confectionery brand would say that you should only eat their food occasionally or it should be a treat. But at least speaking for myself, it's quite hard to stop at one biscuit. It's very hard to, see the guidance and follow it. And I think that, sometimes large companies should take more responsibility actually in terms of allocating the correct serving size or a more realistic one, or, communicate the negative health implications of eating their food at large quantities. We know this, I think we all do, but actually putting it into practice is difficult. And in our team, at least, it's been really tricky to provide guidance. I mean, maybe that's not what we can do, but what we can say is that the most profitable companies in the index have more products that are unhealthy. And so there is this relationship here that unhealthy food is making a lot of money. So it might be kind of counterproductive or not intuitive from a business perspective to reduce these quantities.
And yet, from a regulatory perspective, there's a risk that companies are creating, and as Mike's pointed out, potentially from the perspective of retailers and consumer pressure. There are questions in the chat, but I'd love to hear more from the room, and particularly if there's anyone here from the food industry. But first, the gentleman at the front here.
Hi, my name's Richard. I'm from Intel, and I look after our consumer research. I'm not from the food industry, sorry. I'm hearing a sort of positive story that reporting is improving, transparency is improving. I'd be interested in building some of the points you've heard a little bit. What do you think the major drivers of that are? Is that coming from consumer expectation? Is it competition between brands? Is it compliance? You could just say, yes, it's all of those. But I mean, I'd be interested in your views on which of those drivers are strongest.
Before we pick that up, let's hear some more from you.
There's one just around the corner there.
Ah, sorry. Thank you.
Hi there. My name's Sam from Nomad Foods, so we're the owner of Bird's Eye. So the question really is, first of all, we totally agree with transparency, and I actually am really interested in how you've evolved the index from previous years. I think on nutrition, we do have concerns about some of the claims that are being made about ultra-processed, where Nova was never designed as an actual tool to decide on the health of food. So I think it's important for the index to kind of differentiate between what's maybe a perception or an emotional reaction and what's actually shown as science. So if I use our portfolio, and I'm not commenting on any other food company, so our portfolio is over 90% healthy meal choice using the Ofcom model, so non-HFSS. 80% of our portfolio is also under Nova considered to be ultra-processed. So it's fundamentally flawed to use Nova as a marker for health. So I think this is an area that we'd really like to see Tortoise. Actually, my advice would be to get more nutritionally qualified advisors. Some of the people you've mentioned are very esteemed doctors, but they're not doctors or qualified nutritionists. So I think the nutrition piece and the health piece, to Mike's point, is really, really key. And I do think there's some kind of flawed claims being made in this area by some really prominent people. So that's just it's not really a question. I think it's just an observation, really.
It's a great observation. Sam, we obviously had a dialogue with every company involved in the index, and I thought the response that we got from Bird's Eye was one of the most interesting things in all the responses. And I think it kind of speaks to the question of, whether, I think Will's point earlier about whether all of the angles that we consider food on are aligned with each other. Because if you're saying, well, you're putting fish in breadcrumbs, and that's a way for people to eat fish and for it to be affordable and that's sustainable, that's great, And if we respond by saying, well, the British public ought to eat fish heads and like it, that's clearly not going to happen. So I did think that was a really interesting conversation. Mike, do you want to pick up the point about levers for change, and then we'll come back to ultra-processed foods?
Yeah, and the levers for change are many. There is no single one at the moment. I think the biggest lever for change is actually going to be what happens behind the scenes. It will become harder and harder to run the food value chains as we've grown up with them over the last 30, 40 years in a climate-disrupted world. Pure and simple. So we've already got, despite the media reporting, most of the food industry is running on wafer-thin margins. It's running on fumes. It's worked flat out through Brexit, the pandemic, cost of living crisis to hold things together. I applaud it. I've been in it. I've seen how hard people work. But it's getting harder and harder. We've seen the droughts in Spain. We've seen the impact of heat on crop yields last summer in Europe and across the UK. We're going to find that we just have to get off our backsides and respond. Now, I just want to sort of touch into the customer bit, because there's CSRD from the EU in terms of reporting, lots of other things which we haven't got time to talk about. Let's talk about the customer. I've always believed there are 4 segments of customer interest in this space, and you've come out with some great work recently. 10% of people passionately green would be sat in this audience now and sharing their point of view and understanding what we're talking about. 20% of people not engaged, mainly driven by poverty and income, despite a relatively small number of vested interests, rich voices saying not a problem, it's mainly driven by poverty. 2 groups in the middle determine this. 35% of people like green consumers. They want great food, great experiences, great holidays, great cars. They want to be fundamentally less impactful, but not at an on-cost or a sacrifice. We know that. And 35% of people are utterly driven by locality. They were born in Bradford as I was, live in Bradford, die in Bradford, what are you doing for Bradford before you tell me about the Amazon and the Arctic? And I think we've got to find a way of connecting people much more back to the locality of where food is produced, and we talk about provenance, etc. But we live in this global food system where everything just seems to appear on a supermarket shelf. So to me, that is emerging. My final point on this one. When you talk to that base of people out there that consume food, 70% of them are saying, I'm worried. I'm really worried about what I'm consuming, how it's produced. But only 30% actually feel that they can do something about it. It is the biggest untapped customer need in history, that gap between I want to do it, but I can't. And the businesses that close that gap, great, delicious food at a great price, healthy food that's also good for nature and for me, they're the ones that win in the future.
Thanks, Mike. And Maddie, would you like to pick up the point about ultra-processed food? I mean, I don't know if it's a point with an answer, but it's certainly one that's worth responding to.
I'll have a go, but I'll probably pass on to my colleague Sophie as well, not to dodge a difficult question, but Sophie's been working really hard to, work through the thinking around using Nova. I think what I would say, first of all, is that Nova, while, it's a growing body of research, it is still the most recognised piece of methodology around classifying ultra-processed food. And we felt that adding it in this year would invite questions such as that to talk as a room about how we should be doing things better. And we review our methodology year on year to reflect these types of controversies or changes as the conversation matures. So thank you for the point. But I don't know if, Sophie, if you've got anything else to add around Nova.
Yeah, so I think it's important to say that sorry, I really can't crane my neck this far, but the index has added ultra-processed food, but that doesn't mean that it's sort of taken over the view of nutrition. So it's one of 8 indicators that look at nutrition. And, fish fingers perform really, really well on all of the other nutrition indicators. And it's a point that we get from the food industry, which is that sometimes ultra-processed food, it aligns with all of the other guidelines on high fat, salt, sugar, saturated fat. And the argument there is, well, then it's just a proxy. It's just a proxy for all the other nutrition measures, so why are you using it? And if that's true, then that's fine. It's a good proxy, and it's not causing any harm. If the opposite is true, which, you have mass-produced bread, that's nutritionally, it's not HFSS. You have fish fingers, you have tinned beans with preservatives in. So you have food that scores well on nutrient profiling model and isn't HFSS but is still ultra-processed. Then ultra-processed food is doing something important, because if these links to negative health outcomes are still the case for ultra-processed food that isn't nutritionally imbalanced, then it's the processing itself that's doing something. Now, we're not nutrition experts, we can only be advised by them, but we've taken advice from experts, and we decided that given that these links are present in scientific studies linking ultra-processed food to overconsumption, to obesity, to cardiovascular disease, that it was important to add as part of a holistic picture. So that's not to say fish fingers are bad for you, it's to say that fish fingers are really good for you on those of the classic nutrition metrics, but they are also ultra-processed, and so fish might be better for you if it wasn't ultra-processed.
Thanks, Sophie.
In 30 seconds. This is exactly why we need government leadership, because there are so many different points of view. We've got science with the view, campaigners, we've got the food industry. Everybody's got a legitimate view on this. There is no neat answer. And therefore, in the marketplace confusion, government needs to step into the marketplace and say, 1 year sprint study, we're going to listen to the science, the campaigners and business, and then we're going to come up with a point of view. Just stepping back on the sidelines and hoping it works itself out, it ain't going to. And this doesn't serve the end, the people that are eating the food well, the producer well, anybody. We need leadership.
Thanks, Mike. Maddie, there's a question from the chat that I'd like to put to you, and I'm really pleased with this question because I do have the word meat written down on my bingo card for today, and it's the first time it's come up. To what extent has the index considered the actual carbon footprint of the produce and ingredients these companies are using? As we know, meat and dairy is a huge contributor to emissions and land use. So how much of a part does produce itself play?
Yeah, so, as I mentioned earlier, the companies in the index sell a variety of different things. We do have meat companies in the index, we have others as well. I think probably to answer that question in an indirect way is that number 1 is Cranswick, number 30 is Safina UK. So they're both selling meat as a significant part of their business, but one is at the top and one is at the bottom. So it might tell us something about the way the food is produced. It might tell us something about the overall disclosure rates. I suppose it is a tricky question because there is so much nuance with how meat is made, and it is a very fiery conversation in the food system. I think we could do more research on sort of connecting products with their emissions, but that data is not available to us right now. All we have is a company's overall emissions and also what they make. We can't draw links between those. That would be great if we could, but hopefully with better disclosure, as I mentioned, some companies are really going there, then we would be able to do that type of analysis.
Thanks, Maddie. A couple more points from the room. Nikki first, please, and then Joe.
And you've got right at the back as well.
Ah, okay, thank you.
Maddie, to you. I think ultimately these companies are, their business model is based on ultra-processed food. Do you think if they were to have to contribute to the NHS, that might make them sort of readjust their business model? And, you know, after all, we're all part of the clean-up, aren't we? So, you know, we should really be, it's about, this time is about working together. So could that be
if they have to pay for Wegovy? Is that your argument? Okay.
What did you say?
If they have to pay for Wegovy, Judge. Yeah, okay. Let's hear from James.
Jeevan, thank you. Hello, I'm James Harding. I just wanted to, I work here at Tortoise, I'm editor here at Tortoise. I just want to ask Mike a question. So, Mike, just to exaggerate for effect a little, I find the food companies in some ways less likeable than the fossil fuel companies, in that at least the fossil fuel companies, you can engage with them and you can have real sort of hand-to-hand combat on what are they declaring, what are their metrics, you know, you can see them acting. With the food companies, there's something very strange going on. Which is, who are these guys? You don't know who they are. It's not clear where they come to the table. It's not clear how they organise and talk to themselves, except behind closed doors and on their own terms. And as much as I think this is great, what we're doing here, you'd love it to be in a room where the 10 largest food companies are, but I can't find out where they are. So I just wondered where do they meet? Where do you take this kind of information and say, can we have an open discussion about what you're doing and how you're changing?
Great question. It's saying you're worse than Exxon, our way of making friends in this room.
Welcome. Exactly. Have a coffee, pastry, tuck in.
Do you want me to dive into that one straight away? Yeah. So the tactical response is somewhere like the Consumer Goods Forum brings the world's biggest food and drink manufacturers, the Cokes, the Pepsis, the Walmarts, the Tesco's, the Nestle's, the Unilevers. Together, there's $3 trillion worth of annual turnover in that room together. It's represented by the chief executives of these businesses, 25 from the manufacturing space, 25 from the retail space. That's the go-to place. If you want to have a difficult conversation with the barons that control that industry, that's the place. Clearly, in the UK, you've got the BRC, the FDF in terms of manufacturing, Zero Carbon Forum in terms of hospitality, NFU in terms of farming. Where I will align with you, and we could spend 20, 30 minutes sort of playing tennis on this one, but I absolutely think that the trade bodies need to step forward on this one. In the last 3 years, and again, for reasonable reasons I understand, Brexit, pandemics, cost of living, they've hunkered down and drawn the wagons in together, and it's like, keep your heads down, all this incoming at us. Actually, they need to be much more proactive at saying, this is hard for you individually to tackle. The reason that we exist as a trade body is to collectively understand these systems changes, whether it's a food debate or it's a carbon debate. All those trade bodies have set a net zero 2040 scope 1, 2, 3 goal. How many of them are actually working on it actively today to actually find solutions? Probably Zero Carbon Forum in terms of hospitality. The others need to do more. So CGF, big global conversation, they're UK bodies. The final point about likability, I'm going to push back a little bit just to sort of finish it off. The challenge that the food industry has is that both the industry itself and those that surround it don't fully understand its impact. So when we talk about Exxon, we know it's a vast 500 million tonne CO2 equivalent emitter a year. Saudi Aramco, you can work the numbers out. When we're trying to build the carbon footprint across tens of thousands of SKUs that go into a retailer from hundreds of thousands of farms and factories around the world, it's really hard to be able to say that. Now, that's an excuse today. That ain't going to be an excuse in 2030, and this is where I'll start the conversation about data. This industry fundamentally needs to understand better its footprint, how it's going to reduce it, and its risks. And to my sort of flippant point about it's much more complicated than it was a diesel car, it wasn't, now it's an electric car, know what BMW have to do. It needs to define, in partnership with civil society, What's the end point we're trying to reach to for the food system of the future? And of course, weaving the adjacency of well-being at the same time. It's tough. Lots of reasons to put your head down and hope that goes away. It ain't, because that food system is running on fumes. It's broken in so many ways. So I challenge back on the language, but I think in terms of what we're both trying to find a bridge on here, agree in terms of pathway forward.
While we have you on, Mike, would you like to pick up Nikki's NHS point as well? Is that something that's going to drive...
Annabelle.
Sorry, yeah.
Annabelle's point. So this is all about externalities. You know, here is an industry that the reason it can sell some of the cheapest food in the world in the UK marketplace is that everybody else bears the cost of environmental pollution, animal welfare impacts, and human health impacts as well. And again, let's start with visibility. You know, before we dash into externalities and say, you know, it's going to cost you £1.7 billion of your profits each year, we have to be able to understand what the carbon footprint is and what the pound footprint is, because nature or society or the health system is bearing the cost of your existence. So we need to be able to build that. So the next level of transparency for me is start to understand those externalities. Again, been very advised in how I say this. No one individual company should then take that onto its balance sheet and say, we will, you know, prostrate ourselves in front of the greater good, go out of business because we're going to pay all our profits into this fund when no one else does. But again, I keep coming back to systems change. Government needs a point of view on externalities. And it's the simplest thing to do. A lot of the change that we face into with the food system, it's really hard. Subsidising all the bad practices that we subsidise today is relatively easy to remove. It's a great question.
Thank you. There are a couple more hands raised. First, Catherine, then Joe, and then the lady at the back, please. Please do, yeah.
Hi, I'm Catherine Chong of Clear. Really appreciate what Mike said, and I'm trying not to... I should just say, this is the second year that the index talk about lack of data and how the index is not what we've all like to see because of data. And I wonder what the team would like to do in terms of encouraging companies to make the data available. I do think that you do have that power, and I do want to make a point about the life cycle of news. For the last few weeks, there seems to be some interest to look at how we are going to reach 1.5 Celsius increase in global warming in the next 5 years. Yeah. We know that the global non-food consumption has transgressed planetary boundaries by many times in some of the areas: freshwater eutrophication, freshwater ecotoxicity, and all that has a lot to do with how we farm our food and how we, not just how we process and manufacture our food. And I think that conversation is just need to happen a lot more, and looking into emission tree is scope 3 is so important. Can we not just talk about it's not available, therefore we can look further into this? Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
And this is a question from the chat, and I think it's actually quite similar to your question around sort of data, which is that obviously one of the issues we've talked about is the lack of data, but also sort of how disparate it is, and sort of, you know, you have to compare quite different things. And so I have a question from Maria in the chat, which is sort of, is it possible to have a sort of more unified data system for the food system, into which sort of all players in the food system can contribute to a uniform system of data and metrics, and sort of how would we get there?
Thank you. And there's a lady at the back with her hand raised.
Oh, that must be.
Thank you.
My name is Ezgi. I'm from Boston Consulting Group. My question is around, I think we're talking about the systems change and the importance of that. And I think one of the key things that we see with our clients, who are, some of them are on this list, is that they don't have access to the farmers. For example, they don't have access to the ranchers. There are intermediaries in between who facilitate that transaction. And as that requires a huge system change to actually influence through the value chain. And one of the things that keeps coming up in that conversation is the role of carbon markets, and also the threat of carbon markets being able to claim the benefits that they want to claim as they're decarbonizing the value chain. So I was wondering how you see the role of carbon markets and how you see companies benefiting from it or navigating through it while transitioning into this decarbonized future.
Great question. And the lady in the middle.
Hi, my name is Sahar. I'm a food systems researcher from Oxford. My main question is that the index focuses on the largest food companies, and all of them tend to have integrated supply chains. Yeah. So to connect some of the other questions there, quite a bit of the food industry in the UK is SMEs. And if they were to participate in this big data gathering and systems change activities, they can't really enter into it. And they're having to deal with supply chains where they don't necessarily have that control that the lady there spoke about. So like in terms of wish list items for what happens with the food index, if the methodology were to be advanced to include SMEs, how do you think they would fare? And I think like one point that I think all of us should be aware of is that the index is a snapshot in time, because quite a lot of the disruptions that large companies and SMEs are going to be affected by are taking place in other bits of the world, which is going to decimate quite a lot of the reporting. So if they get points for reporting and being transparent about good data, what happens if they're reporting bad data? Is that going to be like, we're now going to step away from the data landscape, or how does the, I don't want to say how will you deal with it, but as
how do we adjust to it? Yeah. Okay. All right. Great question. Thank you. Mike, do you want to come in first on carbon markets and maybe carbon tariffs too? Really interesting point.
As I do, I remember this gentleman asked a question right at the beginning about soil, and I just want to sort of remind us that what soil does, a bit like water in the food system, it's geography specific. So when we talk about carbon generally, we can sort of say, well, Marks and Spencer emitted a ton of carbon in Bangladesh, in China, UK, that's 3 tons. As soon as you start talking about the soil in the field and how much it specifically captured or didn't, how much water was used in a catchment basin in Kenya compared to northern Scotland, geography inserts a data set that's exponentially larger in terms of the one that you have to manage, which takes me to a second point that was raised over here, which is businesses that decided to outsource knowledge of their farming base to others. That was their conscious choice. And in the old paradigm, allowing some middleman, trader, opacity to sort of be able to, you could hide from responsibility. And I just don't think that's possible now. You don't know where your risks and your opportunities are. You don't know how to support the farming base in the way that maybe the middle folk don't want to. You've got to create simpler, shorter, more transparent supply chains to exist in this brave new world. So it is a transformation of how we think in terms of that. So I want to see more visibility in terms of what we do. To the point about SMEs, brilliant point. And one of the things I would encourage you to do to add to the index is there's an awful lot of wholesalers that are invisible out there that feed food out into tens of thousands of smaller businesses, the corner curry shop, the corner restaurant. They've got to be part of this because these are big businesses, and unless they're engaged, hundreds of thousands of SMEs are cut off from being able to make a difference. And the final point, people were asking about making sure that there is one approach to data in the UK. I mentioned RAP already. The Food Standards Agency, I think it's PCAF, have come up with an initiative that's starting to drive commonality of data collection across the food system. It is critical. We'll tie ourselves in knots if we Tesco's and Sainsbury's go off on divergent routes. We need similar approaches. A few thoughts.
Could I ask you to respond on the point about the standardisation of data?
Sure. So we do consult experts through the process of delivering our methodology, and advice or kind of observations that we regularly hear is, wouldn't it just be easier if everyone was singing from the same hymn sheet and collecting the data in the same way? That would certainly make my job and our team's job easier as well. I think as sustainability becomes more recognised, more talked about, and also more intrinsic and integrated into businesses, we will start to see a maturity of kind of what the important data is, identifying that, and also standardising a way to collect it. So, a point before about auditing and, the financial reports side of the company's house filing is, super well audited, and I would love to see the same in kind of the environmental space as well. I don't think we're there just yet, but I do think that year on year we have seen, though transparency is, again, a kind of consistent theme that companies are not being as transparent, we have seen companies for the first time ever publish their first sustainability reports, and that is in part because of the work that we're doing in identifying where they are. And to take the other question about what does our team want to do with the data and how do we kind of see this developing further, I would love it if every company in our index published their own sustainability report. That isn't the case at the moment. And so there is just a lack, a vacuum of information. And it might be that the companies have this information, they just haven't been told to publish it yet. It might be that they don't have the information, they don't know where to start. And so I think disentangling those two things would be really effective, and working with the companies to to encourage a race to the top, this index is not supposed to be a kind of name and shame. It really is supposed to be driving positive change, and we hope that we're doing that in our work.
Thanks very much, Maddie. I'd like to come back first to you, Mike, and then to Maddie for some kind of closing thoughts on this. And just, I guess, the kind of thing that's kind of emerging really obviously in the course of this conversation is that I think as a society we have a really, well, as a society, one thing is really obvious. I don't think we want to consume less. I mean, I think that's obviously not the case, and we certainly don't want to consume less meat, but I think there is a strong desire on the part of the public for more sustainability and better animal welfare, and that, as you said earlier, Mike, is going to be reflected in pressure on retailers and ultimately going to be reflected all the way along the supply chain. Mike, I just want to come back to you for a sort of final thought, really, and just ask you, we've got a group of people together in this room who obviously really care about this subject. Many of them are in a position to make real change. What would you like to see from them in terms of how they use the information in the index, how they respond to it?
I mean, first is mindset. I think too many people in our industry are still there thinking this is a risk to be managed incrementally, 2% less carbon next year, job done. The next decade is utterly transformational in terms of the risks to the food system that everybody on this planet depends upon to survive. As MI5 said, we're no more than 4 square meals away from insurrection in any modern society, let alone in a developing one. I want to see a mindset in the boardrooms across this industry that recognises how big that challenge is. The second thing is data. Again, you cannot possibly step into improving this world without having a fundamentally better data package across your value chain, where your products are produced, right down to a SKU level, right down to a field soil level. You need to build that. It won't be done overnight, but you need to build it. And the third thing is strategy. And let me just finish off. If I was still Chief Sustainability Officer at a big food company now that was selling lots of protein, I would take a step back on the totality of my protein offer and say, strategically, I need to decarbonise this. I need to sort of think through the animal welfare perspectives, the human health perspectives, the farmer perspectives in terms of a just transition. Where can I run ahead now on my own? Where do I need to invest in innovation? Where do we need to work in partnership with the rest of the industry? Where do I need to be calling and lobbying for change at a sort of governmental policy level? But at the moment, most food businesses are dealing with this at a very tactical level, a SKU level or a category level. And something's coming, make a response up, dash to the next crisis. You need to get ahead of it. And I want to see much more strategic thinking in the boardroom and owning your own destiny. Because again, I've seen it happen in other industries. In the end, people get so cheesed off with the lack of progress, you'll have other people dictating your pathway forward, and that's never nice.
Thanks very much, Mike. Maddie, I'd like to come to you for the last word, really. You started this conversation by saying that we want to see greater transparency. That's something that would be enormously helpful to us in sort of creating the work that we're doing. What do you think that you'd like to see companies doing with this data, and what would help us as a society in terms of their engagement?
Good question. So I think the message that I want to just share is that, reporting data would not penalise you in our index. It is so much better to understand and be visible what your impact is than to hide in the shadows. And I think for such a long time, the status quo has been private companies selling own label goods. They can just lurk away and nobody would point a finger at them or shine a light. I think we're over that now, and I think we need to actually step up. In terms of what to do with the data, I think it does need to be integrated as part of a, operationally strategic kind of, don't just collect the data in the sustainability team and call it a day, release your annual report and wait for it to be scrutinised. That needs to actually be the levers for change in the business. And we speak to sustainability professionals at the companies in the index, and they're really championing the way, but it does feel like they're on their own. So I think sustainability also needs to be something that everyone across the business owns, and it can't just be, a tick box exercise. I think we've done that for too long now, and now we actually do need to see that systemic level change that Mike was talking about before.
Thanks very much, Maddie. Thanks very much to all of you for coming here. Thanks, Mike, for joining us. But most of all, a big thanks to all of the data team who are practically asleep or maybe dead on their feet at this point. Thank you all very much. Thank you.